Welcome you all here today to our third session of our Sanctuary in Our Time and Place series. I'd like to, before I introduce Bob and Cindy, our speakers today, I'd like to start with a prayer. It's called God of Departures. Thank you for being the God of movement and belonging. We confess that we have created a world in which there are native citizens on the inside and immigrants on the outside. We are grateful that in scriptures you reveal to us the normalcy of movement, that in its pages we find people who moved for the same reasons people still move today. Help us to internalize the words of Paul, to know deep in our hearts that the only citizenship that matters is the kingdom of heaven. As much as we long for place, we need you to show us how to make room for others. Expand our vision, our sense of family and country, our knowledge, and ultimately we all belong to you, not to the places we happen to be born. Give us eyes to see the human movement in our midst. As we find ourselves in a time of growing nationalism and xenophobia, give us the courage to reject these narratives and instead to reimagine our world, to bring into being where everyone belongs, where we can all become naturalized and included. Amen. Thinking about my grandparents. Excuse me. Well, got through it, I guess. Okay, now it's time for something more lighthearted. Bob and Cindy are here to present their story, Migration to America.
So, as you may know, we had originally planned to have folks from the immigrant story here to present that story of Emmanuel Turrentine from Rwanda. And we were very much looking forward to that. They are actually doing a large presentation on May 11th at the Research Center, and I encourage you to get tickets to that if you haven't already. It's really well worth your time to listen. But their presentation here kind of fell through at the last moment. And so you get us with an immigrant story. So as you know, we're Cindy and Bob Stodden. We're part of the Sanctuary team.
And I seldom do these presentations. Cindy is the presenter in the family. But she made me a script here, and forgive.
It did.
But forgive me if I go off script occasionally. She already warned me about that.
We're timed.
Okay. So anyway, we start with in 2015. Cindy and I went to Habitat for Humanity Global Build in Romania. And we took the opportunity to travel a few more hundred miles to the east to visit where my family came from, in a town called Friedenthal. This was part of Romania, but is now part of Ukraine. Photos of that trip and the trip we took earlier to Poland and Germany are part of this presentation.
So at that time, I was working at Portland State and completing a doctoral program in education. And one of the components of that program for me was a series of courses in interpersonal neurobiology. So much of what you'll hear today was developed for the certificate program in IPNB. And I've presented it to university studies classes at Portland State. So that's a piece of what you're getting. There'll be a deep dive into neurobiology for a brief period of time. Hang in there, and we return to the story, okay? So throughout history, war, civil conflict, and violence have resulted in forced migrations. People leaving their homes displaced to alien places. Often lacking food, water, clothing, and shelter, attention becomes focused on the bottom rungs of Maslow's hierarchy, meeting basic physiological needs, struggling for safety. Psychologist Peter Levine writes that trauma such as this can rob us of our capacity to live and enjoy life long after any immediate danger has passed. Attention today is focused on migrants who risk the dangerous trek north to the U.S. from Latin America, or of those crossing the Mediterranean Sea in rafts from North Africa to Europe, or those who have fled the devastating destruction of their communities in Ukraine, Israel, and Gaza. Trauma will impact each individual in a unique way, given the nature of their experience, their age, developmental maturity, the quality of their early attachments to family and caregivers, the place they've come from, and who is with them now.
So in 1814 through 1842, at the invitation of the Russian monarchy, some 9,000 Germans, they were colonists, migrated to an area that was known, and I'm not sure if it's still known as Bessarabia. That region covers part of Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, and borders on the Black Sea. So they were seeking farmland to farm, but also freedom of religion, education, freedom from military conscription, and that was all promised by the Russian government. The aim of the Russian government was to entice German farmers to cultivate the fertile steppes that bordered on the Black Sea. 24 German colonies, which were referred to as mother colonies, and later there were also daughter colonies followed. The Stadel family, my ancestors were among those, oops.
Sorry.
Oh, the Stadel family, my ancestors were among those who migrated to Bessarabia in 1830s and helped establish the mother colony of Friedenthal. By 1930, 100 years later, that Friedenthal, which means Valley of Peace, had become a town of 2,200. Johannes Stadel, my grandfather, became a prosperous farmer, the first in town that had a car, a Studebaker. I remember those. He served as mayor of Friedenthal for 8 years. This is his farm.
So I have long been fascinated by the Friedenthal story and the power of that place in the lives of Bob's extended family, many of whom settled in the Yakima Valley after World War II. There's some books. There's some books on the table there. There's a big fat book that's titled Friedenthal, and it lists all the names of the families from that town. And Bob's family is in that book, as well as he and his brothers are listed there. So, historian and architect Dolores Hayden writes that places trigger memories for insiders who have shared a common past. And at the same time, places often can represent shared paths to outsiders, people like myself.
It's my turn. Okay. In October 2015, Cindy and I went to Ukraine, as we said before, and visited the towns of Friedenthal, now called Burentopoly. I butchered that all the time. and the neighboring town of Gnadenthal, where my mother was born. Friedenthal was a farming community. Many of the crops that they grew there, my family then grew in the Yakima Valley, mostly grains, fruits, and vegetables.
So environmental psychologists talk about place attachment as a process similar to that of infant attachment to parental figures. They contend that place attachment can take on social, material, and ideological dimensions as individuals develop in public life as residents of a particular community.
This is the Kelm family home. They're relatives of mine. No Germans live there now, but it is maintained as a small museum by the Kelm family. It's a window into the history of the former life of the Bessarabian Germans.
And so this is what the homes look like on the inside. Children and their parents made their own toys. Ella Human, another Stadl relative and Yakima Valley resident, described for me in a series of interviews how she made bricks from mud using matchboxes for molds and built things like doll houses with those. Pork bones, the large knuckles, were used to make toy horses. Now in her 90s, Ella mentioned by name the 9 little girls she used to play with, telling me where they lived in relationship to her house.
This is a picture of a family. My mother, Bertha Traub, was from Gnadenthal, another mother colony, a short distance from Friedenthal. She's on the bottom left. Okay. From the plot maps we studied before our trip, we think this may have been my mom's home or another Traub family member in Gnadenthal. The exterior fence, bench, and gate are standard features of Bessarabian homes.
So Ella said that by the entrance to the home, there was usually a pillar, which you see in the photo, and an iron gate. And then you'd have a small bench. And that was for the older people, she said, to sit and visit with each other. On Saturday, you brushed the dirt off the sidewalk, so it was really nice for Sunday when neighbors would come. And they'd walk by and stop, and the old people would sit and talk.
This is the original well in the side yard. As you can see, canned tomatoes and squash in the original cellar. By the way, we went there and those cellars seem to be untouched over the decades. I can imagine my mother descending those stairs of the cellar to retrieve canned tomatoes, pickles for a meal. We had those same home canned items in our home in Wapato, Washington. These are my parents, Bertha Traub and Jakob Stadl. They were married in 1939 in the Lutheran Church in Gnadenthal. Today, the church is a community center. My brother, Egon, and was born there in 1940.
So psychiatrist Dan Siegel writes that in our journeys through life, unexpected turning points arise, and we often don't understand their long-term impact. Such a turning point took place in 1939 when Hitler and Stalin made a pact. Stalin reclaimed all the land ceded to the German farmers in Bessarabia, now some 150 settlements. In return, Hitler got the German farmers. Evicted from their land as of September 15, 1940, the residents of Friedenthal, along with the German farmers from the other villages, began a long, forced trek north. Hitler's plan used the Bessarabian Germans to resettle the land he had confiscated from the Poles. In Poland, they became part of the Nazi General Plan Ost. The SS confiscated Polish property, reallocating it to the German settlers as part of Hitler's plan for Germanization and ethnic cleansing.
This picture is of my mom and dad. Excuse me. This picture shows my mom and us kids. Anyway, my mom and dad were given a farm to manage in Kotliska, a short distance from Kutno. I was born on this estate in 1943. Here I am as an infant in the arms of my mother, along with my siblings, Egon and Helga, and Egon with our aunt Olga on the right. But in 1945, Russia invaded Western Poland. The pact with Hitler had dissolved years earlier. Bessarabian Germans had to flee, this time further west, to Germany. Many were overtaken and killed, or in the case of several of my family, aunts, uncles, cousins, they were captured and sent to labor camps in Siberia and Stalingrad.
Edwin Kelm's story is particularly poignant. You saw his family home in the earlier photo. Edwin was 10 when the Kelm family left Friedenstahl and was eventually resettled in Kutno. At age 15, he watched his father and 400 other Germans shot by the Russian army. Edwin was captured by a Russian soldier who then asked his superior what to do with the boy. Kill him, he was told. But the soldier instead took him outside, shot his revolver in the air, and told Edwin to run. He never wanted to see him again. Alive but hungry and alone, Edwin made his way to a Polish farmhouse, a house only hours before occupied by German settlers. A Polish woman took him in, fed him, gave him a place to sleep in the barn. She sent him away the next day, and Edwin eventually found his way to Germany and then to Canada.
My mom, who was pregnant at the time, took me and two siblings to the train station in Kutno. With the help of Polish neighbors, it was the last train out of Kutno. My father was not with us. He had been drafted into the German army.
So it was October when Bob and I stood on this train platform in Kutno, and I was cold. I tried to imagine what it had been like for my mother-in-law, pregnant, alone, and trying to manage 3 young children. Egan, 5 at the time, still remembers bombs exploding around them as they traveled by train to Germany. So, what is trauma? Certainly Bob and his family were enveloped in horrific trauma. But how might neurobiology deepen our understanding of what it means to be with others in the midst of trauma and mourning? This is where I go into the neurobiology deep dive. And I promise I'll come back to the Friedenstahl story, and hopefully you'll see some connections. So trauma has been defined as deeply distressing or disturbing experiences. It occurs when both external and internal resources are inadequate to cope with an external threat. Trauma does to the human brain what a virus does to the computer. It wreaks havoc. Individuals who experience unresolved trauma can be seen as being filled with both chaos, intrusive bodily sensations, images, emotions, memories, and rigidity, avoidance behaviors, numbing, amnesia. But therapist and author Bonnie Badenoch has said, the essence of trauma has more to do with our felt sense of aloneness in times of pain and fear than with the events themselves. Many have observed that surviving trauma often depends on who accompanies us, who we are with. So interpersonal neurobiology is an interdisciplinary field that works toward clinical applications of research emerging in the neurosciences. Dan Siegel, an MD and clinical professor of psychiatry at the School of Medicine in UCLA, describes a triangle in which brain, mind, and relationships are interconnected. It's a perspective that recognizes the interconnected nature of our human experience. Excuse me. This keeps us on track. Okay. So it tries, yeah. So there are roughly 100 billion neurons in adult human brains, each with synaptic connections to other neurons, generating some 2 million miles of neural highways within each of us. Yeah. Headquartered in the skull, the brain extends throughout the body. Through the central and autonomic nervous systems, the brain has fibers wrapping around our heart, gut, muscles, and joints. We have, in essence, an embodied brain. The brain then functions as an interconnected and integrating system of subsystems. The words psychology and psychiatry come from the Greek word psyche, meaning soul, and mind has this sacred quality. Scientists and philosophers have resisted defining the mind, but in a gathering in the 1990s, Siegel gained agreement on a definition. The mind is an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. The mind monitors and regulates internal states. It's the source of consciousness, the experience of being aware, and it allows us to have an internal life, a relationship with ourself. I'm a rather concrete thinker, and I find that when you dissect a cadaver, you can find the brain, but you can't find the mind. So the brain's structure and function are determined by how experiences, especially interpersonal relationships, shape the genetically programmed maturation of the nervous system. Optimal relationships are likely to stimulate the growth of integrative fibers in the brain, whereas neglectful and abusive relationships specifically inhibit the healthy growth of neural integration in a young child. So, a brief exercise. So, tell me what I'm experiencing right now. Anticipation. What else? Smell. Ooh, yeah. Pardon? Hunger. Hunger, right. What else? Sound of the paper. Remembrance. Mouth is watering. What? Taste, right. What taste? Chocolate, right. And what else? Pleasure. What's inside? Peanut butter, right. Peanut butter, right. Okay.
By the way, that's Cindy's favorite candy.
Right. Okay. So Italian researchers in 1996 used brain scans to observe the parts of the macaque brain that are activated when the monkey breaks open and eats a peanut. But what was really interesting, when they did scans on macaques watching their mate eat, the same parts of their brains lit up as well. They seemed to be experiencing the event along with their companion, even though they had no peanuts. You knew what I was experiencing as I ate this peanut butter cup, maybe even salivating, right? More recently, Marco Iacoboni extended this work with what are now called mirror neurons to humans to help understand the process by which we take the experience of another into ourselves, how we experience attunement and accompaniment. Mirror neurons code the actions and intentions of other individuals. They help develop empathy, and they help us imitate and learn social behavior. Our neurobiology puts us within each other. Okay, so one of the social skills I learned from my mother, you don't eat in front of other people, but you share what you've got.
I was going to say, are you going to finish that?
Bonnie, can you help pass those out?
Does that mean I get two?
Rewards. So, from the moment of birth, infants closely watch their primary caregivers. And again, using brain scans, researchers see that what lights up in the parental brain lights up in the newborn brain. Baby brains come with billions of cells ready for activation, but they are wired via interaction with parents and caregivers. Infant brains mimic adults in emotional well-being. Attention, face-to-face interactions, these build resonance and development of our inner community. So let's take a brief but closer look at neural systems activated in trauma. And here we're indebted to Stephen Porges and his work. So as you know, in most vertebrates, there are two primary defense mechanisms, fight or flight and immobilization, or the death freeze. Both of these are under the control of the autonomic nervous system, but they're powered by different subsystems. The development of social behaviors, such as cooperation and care of offspring, differentiated mammals from their reptilian ancestors. This required that these strong defensive reactions be downregulated. So over time, another vagal pathway evolved to allow an integrated social engagement system, what Porges calls a window of tolerance. This system emerged from a face-heart connection via the ventral vagal nerve. It's a pathway that coordinates the heart with the striated muscles of the face and head. This face-to-heart connection enables individuals to communicate safety to one another through eye contact, patterns of facial expression, tone of voice. So Bonnie Badenoch offers this graphic interpretation of Porges' theory. At the top, we have capacity to hold a full spectrum of emotions. But as we move downward, we enter states in which our capacity to regulate ourselves in the presence of intense emotion is much smaller. Excitement and fear, or deep rest and collapse. These are neurobiologically close neighbors. Neuroception is Porges' word for the neural evaluation of risk. It does not require conscious awareness. Rather, it's a reflexive mechanism capable of instantly shifting physiological states. When I first began working with the Department of Community Justice, colleagues said, when you're working with people on supervision, doing home visits, going into the jail or prison, pay attention to the hair on the back of your neck. I now know they were telling me to honor the neuroception of danger. But Porges says we can neurocept cues on the other end of the spectrum as well. Cues that say, you are safe here. And these are an efficient and profound antidote for trauma. A person experiencing acute anxiety, fear, or complete shutdown may begin to move into social engagement in the presence of another caring individual. Bonnie Badenoch represents this with those outer diagonal lines, and she calls this a ventral vagal embrace for the nervous system of the person represented by the inner diagonal lines. It's a felt sense of containment. This is the gift of safety we can offer another by our presence. We know the brain is continuously changing, even old brains. And herein lies hope, in our relationships with one another, through play, game night, loving family encounters, therapy, education. we can modify painful or frightening experiences. One other author I want to mention, Darcia Narvaez, writes about evolution, culture, and wisdom in her book, Neurobiology and the Development of Human Morality. She says that in traditional context, parents and children find a lot of pleasure in intimate relationships and the social group. I hear this in the stories from Friedenstahl. Responsive caregiving sets up an ethic of engagement that, together with compassion, flows out of secure attachment. And out of this, she says, emerges communal imagination, an awareness that enlarges the field of possibilities and broadens the landscape for action. Ella described two individuals from Friedenstahl who, in my mind, displayed such communal imagination. In January 1945, one man positioned himself at the Oder River between Germany and Poland. Bridges had been blown up, so as the Bessarabian Germans, fleeing the Russian army, approached the border with their horse-drawn wagons, they found themselves trapped. This man directed them north, describing a place where the Oder River had frozen over. They could cross safely, he said, in the middle of the night. He then met them there and facilitated that crossing. Once they got into Germany, however, the horror continued. Ella described the Allied bombing raids. They killed so many as they fled. And she described the cold, the hunger, the fear. Another man from Friedenstahl positioned himself at a railway depot in southern Germany. Every day he went to the train depot, scouring the faces of those in transition, looking for folks he knew. When he saw someone he recognized, he directed them to a refugee camp where families from Bessarabia were gathering.
I'm back on, yes. My mother, brother, and sister and I reached Germany and were eventually joined by my father, who had been wounded in the war. We settled in Wilkow, a small community northeast of Berlin. Manfred was born, my other young brother, in 1945, and my sister, Nina, in 1949. But Helga, my older sister, died there of diphtheria. After several years there, my father got in trouble with the Soviet-controlled East German regime. Late one night in 1950, my mother and I and father bundled us up and took us by taxi, and we escaped into West Berlin, about 80 kilometers away. That's me here. My family was at the front of a huge exodus from east to west. More than 62,000 East Germans refugees registered in West Berlin in 1950, and we were settled in large warehouse-size camps throughout West Berlin. This influx of refugees prompted the West Berlin government to build a refugee center with massive housing complexes. And the center processed people who came from West Berlin and resettled them in West Germany. So in 1953, my family was among those flown. By the way, in those days, you could not travel by train because you had to go through East Germany. So that was controlled by the Soviets, so we had to fly out. So that was my first airplane ride. So in 1953, my family was flown from Berlin to West Germany, eventually resettled in the Stuttgart area. The Stuttgart area is basically in the state of Baden-Württemberg, the same region that our Bessarabian Germans immigrated from. about 100 years earlier. From the old photos, we think that this house was the one we lived in the village of Wasserstetten. But you probably have guessed Wasserstetten means water town.
So as we traveled in Germany, it was fascinating for me to see what evoked memories. This pump house got Bob, shown here with his cousin Carl, talking about work he did as a young boy helping the water master. And I had never heard that story before, but it makes sense. This environment filled with gauges and pumps and machines is quintessential Bob.
Okay, so this is a picture of the school I attended in Dumpton, the old and the new, and the gate to the school. And this church, too, evoked memories. I remember climbing the staircase and sitting in the balcony as a young boy. It's a Lutheran church.
So as I finished my second interview with Ella, I asked her whether she had regrets, whether there were creative pursuits that she wished she had engaged in. She had, after all, only gone through the 8th grade in Friedenstahl when political conflict and war enveloped her. She stopped me short. "We've had so much fun," she said, to my complete surprise. She described a core group of families from Friedenstahl who settled in the Yakima Valley. They helped each other get started in farming. They started a dance club, and every Saturday night they got together for dinner in someone's home and dancing afterwards. They played cards together. Gradually, as families evolved, English members of the community were included.
Okay, this is a picture of a ship that we traveled on when we came to America. It was this growing core of Friedenstahl members that drew my family to the Yakima Valley. In 1956, my mother and father again bundled us up. We now had 5 children in the family and made their way by train to the northern seaport of Bremen. A 10-day cross-Atlantic trip on the troop ship USNS Langford, which is this one, took us to New York City. From there, we traveled by train to Washington State and the Yakima Valley, where, sponsored by Ed and Ruby Brandt, my father joined his brothers, Godhilf, Herbert, and their families that had been released from the labor camps of Siberia and Stalingrad in 1949, 4 years after World War II.
When we were in Germany, we also met Edwin Kelm. After a career as an engineer in Canada, Edwin Kelm returned to Germany and began a work of reconciliation in Poland and what is now Ukraine. The Kelm home you saw in the earlier photographs, now a museum in Monopoly, is part of that work. Edwin was honored with a medal from Horst Kohler, Germany's president from 2004 to 2010, and himself a Bessarabian German born in Poland in 1943. In Poland, Edwin wanted to commemorate those who had died that day near Kutno, Germans, Poles, and Russians. He gathered people from the town to hear their stories, and he began by sharing his own. When he told about the Polish farm woman who had taken him in, given him soup, he noticed that an elderly woman began weeping. "I was that woman," she said. "I remember you." She was now a widow, living alone, and from then until she died, Edwin provided her a pension to live on. I think of it as a form of reparation. So now some table discussions. If you just turn with each other and reflect, what in this story resonates with you? You know, are there family stories, stories of your ancestors that are called to mind by those that we've shared? And do you recall a time in your own personal history when you experienced trauma and were accompanied or held by a caring other? So go ahead and take some time to share.
Sit at that table. Should we sit at that table? Serves as a paperweight. This year. It's pretty hefty for a paperweight.
Okay, take another minute or so, and then if there are themes or pieces of conversation you'd like to share with the larger group, we'll give you an opportunity to do that.
If you want, I can walk the mic to people, and you can use this. Okay, let's begin wrapping up. Are there things that surfaced at your table that you'd like to share with the larger group? Bob's got a mic he can run to you. You want to give it to Steve? Yeah.
What are we doing?
Anything-
Oh, you want to tell us about that?
Anything bubbling up?
I realized after I shared my ancestry story, which doesn't have a whole lot of trauma associated with it, that this is reminiscent. Actually, my mom's family, her father died in 1960, and in 1964, her mother, brother, sister, and aunt were all killed in a car accident. Right, and that she came from a large Irish Catholic family, so she was the oldest girl. And her youngest brothers were 16 and 17 at the time. And that really did shape the whole family. And I think in some ways they are closer as siblings because they had to rely on each other. You know, my uncles came to live with us. And, you know, my parents at the time were living in a 2-bedroom house with 4 children. They'd converted the den into a bedroom, and suddenly they had 6 kids in a 3-bedroom house, and you know, 2 traumatized boys along with everything else. And so I think the only way they got through that was by caring for each other and not talking about it for 20 years. It wasn't until some of my cousins were younger than me, my cousins were children of the 2 youngest, came to my mom and said, you know, we all know this happened, but none of us know the story. And my mom actually then began to tell the story and eventually kind of wrote up the story of the lives of the people who were killed in a book. So that's how she processed it. All right. I got somebody else. Anybody else?
Which story do we give first? My great-grandfather on my father's side had immigrated from Europe to the United States sometime in the late 1800s. He had a background of Austria-Hungarian, and I don't know exactly what part of that was covered by this Austrian-Hungarian Empire, exactly where they lived, but they spoke Slovak, so they were thinking of the Slovakia area. And my dad and his sister, who was a year older than him, were born in the early 1900s, 1905 and 1906. And my great-grandfather worked in a factory in Chicago, and his health was failing, and he went to the doctor, and the doctor said, you got to get out of the city and get into the country where there's clean air. And I was too young, because by the time I was 9 years old when my dad died, and my aunt died when I was 8 years old. And so I never really had the stories clearly from them, but from what I can remember and what my mom told me about it. When the doctor told him that, when he got home, he told his family, and this is in the late early teens in Chicago, he said, it's silly for me to try to go get a farm here. I got a farm in Europe. So what did they do? They got on a ship, they sailed back to Europe, 1913. When they got there, the war was breaking out. They were told in Germany, I don't know what, it must have been Hamburg, I'm guessing, most likely. And they were told, you can stay, you can get off the ship and go to your village, or you can stay on the ship and sail back to the United States. And my grandfather, being who he was, I never knew, said, I'm going to go here. And they knew pretty well that the war was breaking out. He was going to be in the war. They got back to his farm, and I don't know if it was a week or two or a month or 2 months. He was conscripted into the army, went into World War I, and never came back. So then after the war was over, my grandmother and my father and his sister came back to the United States, back to Chicago.
Anyone else? Thank you.
This is kind of a long story, so I'll try to keep it short. But my mother was Austrian. My parents met after the war. My dad went to medical school in Austria, and that's where they met. My mother was half Jewish. Her father was Jewish. Her mother was Aryan. And when Hitler came to power and took over in Austria, my Jewish grandfather, and he was diabetic, he could no longer get insulin. And he divorced my grandmother, my Aryan grandmother, to protect her and my mother, and went off to live in our apartment by himself. And he actually died there alone because of his diabetes, because he didn't have insulin. My mother was a teenager at the time, and she used to sneak out at night across town to go see her dad. My mother died when she was 40, and I was only 7, so I don't remember a lot. But what I have is what my dad told me. And he told me that she used to tell him that when the Nazi soldiers were in Vienna, they would rape single women, and they just created a lot of havoc. My mother had been married a couple times before she met my father. They were marriages of convenience. One of the marriages was to a gay man who also were persecuted by the Germans, so they married to protect each other. Another marriage, that husband was shot while he was trying to steal food for them to eat. My mother remembers hiding in the attic and hearing the screams of people, women and people across the city as the Germans were, pillaging. That's just part of it. There's a lot of pain for her in her native country of Austria, and she really desperately wanted to come to America. And so she and my dad got married, and he brought her to America.
Maybe one more, and then we'll wrap it up.
This is a continue of Dan's family. His mother did not know when she came, because But she came and everything stopped, and she couldn't know what was happening to her family back very well. So by the 90s, she had a chance to go back and see her family, and she heard the stories of what happened to the people who stayed in Slovakia, and how the young women were put in the basement under the cellar so they wouldn't be raped, and all the things that happened there, that she got escaped because she was able to come out when she did. So it's just another thing of what if this or what if that.
Right. And it's really, it talks, I mean, we can go into that whole thing of intergenerational pain too. And part of in telling our stories and sharing our stories and doing our own work, it is healing the pain, from earlier generations. I think that's really an important work.
So we do have a closing today. You have a copy of it. It's on the back of the announcements. But prior to that, I just want to make one really quick announcement. What I think is really wonderful, and I think this came out through Cindy's message, Cindy and Bob's message, is how community comes and supports you. And this is true with our Malik Zada family. There is quite an Afghan group here, and it is amazing how they come in terms of if kids need toys, here comes a bunch of toys. If they need furniture, here comes some furniture. Well, we have discussed, and it is in the weekly news, that Amina used to drive in Afghanistan. When they arrived here, she started studying in the Oregon driver's manual, because she'll just put it in her own language. She's absolutely amazing with that. And she passed the test. She went to a driving school and first try passed and got her driver's license. If she could have access, they do have a small Camry for 6 people, which we know is not legal, but I don't ask any questions. But they are in need of a vehicle for 6 people. And they, by the way, they are contributing financially to this. When we were there and discussed it, she went back and gave us $600 cash. Boom. Just this family knows how to save. But we are looking for probably a minivan for the family. So if you know of anyone with that, that is the one thing. And the other thing I totally forgot, I got sidetracked by that, is that they're also kind of in need of another bed setting, which has been donated by Bob and Mary Brown. The issue is none of us who work directly with the family have an appropriate vehicle to transport it. It's all ready to go. We just need some help with someone who has a truck who would be willing to help us get to Bob and Mary Brown's and then take it to them. So if you know of anybody or you have that type of vehicle, please come and talk to either Cindy, Bob, or myself, or Lloyd. We are happy to do that. So let's close with the Immigrant's Creed. What I would like to do is read this together. Now, I was a reading teacher for well over 30 years. And one thing I always told, because I worked with kids who are challenged, is that when you come to a comma, I used to tell them, read the punctuation. And that did not mean read comma. That meant do what it tells you to do. And the kids I worked with especially not only had difficulty with articulation and reading, but comprehension as well. And so I said, take just a brief pause and get a picture in your brain of what you just read. And it is amazing. So I may read a little slow because I read the punctuation. So let's start with, if we can, read it together. The Immigrant's Creed. I believe in Almighty God, who guided the people in exile and in Exodus, the God of Joseph in Egypt and Daniel in Babylon, the God of foreigners and immigrants. I believe in Jesus Christ, a displaced Galilean who was born away from his people and his home, who fled his country with his parents when his life was in danger, and returning to his own country, suffered the oppression of the tyrant Pontius Pilate, the servant of a foreign power. He then was persecuted, beaten, and finally tortured, accused and condemned to death unjustly. But on the third day, this scorned Jesus rose from the dead, not as a foreigner, but to offer us citizenship in heaven. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the eternal immigrant from God's kingdom among us, who speaks all languages, lives in all countries, and reunites all races. I believe that the church is the secure home for the foreigner and for all believers who constitute it, who speak the same language and have the same purpose. I believe that the communion of saints begins when we accept the diversity of the saints. I believe in the forgiveness of sin, which makes us all equal, and in reconciliation, which identifies us more than does race, language, or nationality. I believe that in the resurrection, God will unite us as one people in which which all are distinct and all are alike at the same time. Beyond this world, I believe in life eternal, in which no one will be an immigrant, but all will be citizens of God's kingdom, which will never end. Amen. Okay, next week we will take a bit of a diversion in that we actually changed the name of this class to Sanctuary in Our Time and Place. You heard Noel speak this morning about how they would like this church to become a sanctuary if there is a disaster and people need a place to be. So Noel will be here, and we'll hope to see you at 11 o'clock next week. Thank you.